is amazing how we are brought together with people who, for whatever reason, either we need to learn something from them or vice versa. And the plane trip yesterday from Sydney to Auckland was absolutely no different. So there was I thinking I was going to sit on the plane and catch a couple of hours sleep. Little did I know that there was another plans afoot. Oops. I think this is a bit too loud, so isn't it? A bit too loud? Okay. All right, so as John said, what we're going to do is the day is going to be broken down into 3, maybe 4 parts. We'll see how we roll. I'll try and make sure that I'm not speaking for more than about 90 minutes at any one time, absolute max, before we take a break. It'll be between 75 and 90 minutes. It just depends how many tangents I go off on during the course of each session. The first break, I'm assuming that everyone's had some lunch, yes? Yeah, right. So the first break is really just going to be a short comfort break, time to grab a quick coffee. Fortunately, there's a number of coffee options down the road, so not everyone's going to be piling into one shop, I hope. So it'll be a coffee break. It'll be a maximum of about half an hour or so. And then the second break's probably going to get us to dinner. I mean, you can tell me whether it's dinner time or not. I'm not sure what the custom here is. If I'm talking in the US, they want to take dinner at 5:30. If I'm talking in the UK, they don't want it till 7:30. So you tell me when's a good time to take it. And the day's very much going to be broken into 2 parts. The first part, which is really the first 2 sessions, I'm going to focus very much on what's going on in the physical realm, in the physical, empirical, material realm. Everything that we can see going on. And talk a little bit about why it's occurring, what the agenda is, and basically how it's going to unfold, or how the perpetrators of this agenda plan for it to unfold. That doesn't mean to say it will unfold. These people don't always get it their own way. So could we just turn it down a tad? It's just, I think it's a bit too loud. You better show me which one it is, actually. Okay, right. Okay, don't get too close to it with the mic on.
Just don't face it with the mic.
Sorry?
Just don't face it with the mic.
Yeah, exactly. I'll switch it off. Okay. So this first part, we're going to be looking at the things that you can see. I mean, I think there are a lot of people, particularly in Australia, less so in New Zealand it should be, but in Australia there's a lot of people who really don't see that they're heading for a massive cliff edge. Here you're a lot closer to the cliff edge than in Australia. And of course there are a lot of people in New Zealand who have seen that cliff edge and they're leaving the country. And I think it was last year that it was a record year for people leaving New Zealand. I think it was 40,000 people that left New Zealand last year. I mean, New Zealand, like Ireland, has a tradition of manning the world with its expatriates. So, you can pretty much go anywhere in the world and you'll find an Irish community, and you'll normally find an Australian and New Zealand community as well. Well, these are the people that perhaps have seen what's coming and decided that maybe it's better to get out before the ship goes down and try and seek their fortune or whatever elsewhere. It doesn't have to be this way, but it means that people have got to actually wake up to what's occurring, and it's only when people know the rules of the game that they can actually start to comprehend what's occurring and then maybe start to work on trying to find the solutions to avoid getting caught up in the worst of the excess. But in the second half of the day, we're going to change tack completely. And I'm going to sort of develop on something I just touched on the last time I was here. And the core of my presentation really is building on Einstein's observation, which was that we're not going to solve problems by using the same thought processes that got us into them. And what I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to give you the evidence that leads me to believe that those who think they're the rightful rulers of this planetary fiefdom are running very, very scared. They're running very scared. They've given us clues, and when we start to put the pieces of the jigsaw together, and we look at what it is that they're doing to try and prevent what they fear occurring, then things might fall into place. So by the end of the day, what I hope we manage to achieve is one, a lot of what I'm talking about you will be aware of, either all or certainly parts of it, And hopefully what I'm doing is sort of pulling it all together and putting it into the bigger picture for you. But hopefully in the second half of the day, what we're going to start to look at is not just solutions that we can address on the physical realm, but maybe some things that we can do outside of the physical realm. Because that's the area that I believe that those who think they're the rightful rulers of the planet are very, very concerned about. And right now we're in a very, very interesting period of our evolutionary history. Because pretty much almost every indigenous culture, ancient and contemporary, has within their folklore or their mythology or their cosmology an observation that somewhere around about this period we are going to have a tremendous change in the way in which we live our lives. I mean, the Maori, for example, which I learned when I was here 3 years ago, I also learned, of course, that the Maori, or certainly elements of the Maori, believe that they are the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians. But they refer to this time, and it translates as the lifting of the veil. And of course, the meaning of the word apocalypse is the revealing, the revelation. And in fact, when I get back to the UK in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks as of tomorrow, we have an event in London called On the Cusp of the Apocalypse. And of course, the mainstream media have picked up on that, and now they want to interview me because what do I think is going to happen on the apocalypse? But of course, they're expecting me to say something which they're going to be very disappointed, because I'm going to say something very, very different from what they're hoping that I will say, because they're looking for the sensational interview. You know, conspiracy theorist predicts end of world. But it isn't going to happen. That isn't going to be what we're talking about. And when we see what's going on right now, right across the world, we see people starting to wake up to the lies and the deceit. You know, it shouldn't come as any great surprise to those of us that are following how this agenda is unfolding, that both in the UK and in Australia right now, we have major revelations in terms of the behavior and the morality and the integrity of those who think they are in leadership positions, whether that be in politics or aristocracy or whatever. And so the parallel society is getting exposed. The Zionist agenda is becoming exposed. You know, over the last few weeks, we have literally seen a massive sea change in the Western world, in the Western media. You know, we still see the apologists for the Zionist agenda trotting out their articles, but you don't have to search too hard once you get onto the internet, onto the social media, onto the alternative press. You don't have to search too hard to see that basically people have had enough, and they're not going to be dismissed by being labelled as anti-Semitic, Holocaust deniers, or self-hating Jews. You know, people are starting to say, hang on a goddamn second, there's something not quite right here. And of course, including the Jewish people themselves. Because the Jewish people are beginning, there have always been some of course, but the Jewish people en masse are starting to wake up to the fact that the Zionists are using them as a shield. And in fact, one of the most outstanding books written on this subject could only have ever been written by a Jewish historian. It's a guy called Ilan Pappé. Funnily enough, he can't live in Israel. So today he has a tenure at Exeter University in the southwest of England. And he wrote a book a few years ago, I think about 5 years ago now, maybe 6 years ago, and it is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. If anybody else had written that, if a Gentile had written that book, they would have been demonized. But because this guy is a Jewish historian, and in that book he names names, points to dates and meetings, and he basically makes the observation, he said, if there is anybody who thinks that the Zionists will stop before they have achieved the total ethnic cleansing of the Arab population from that area of the Middle East, and ultimately their goal is to establish Greater Israel, i.e. everything from the Nile to the Euphrates, as per the vision of Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. But the Jewish people themselves are now starting to realize that this is not in their best interests. So one of the reasons that the ceasefire has been called is because the Zionist government was being made aware that it was perpetrating a major PR own goal, or in danger of perpetrating it, as the world sort of woke up to the fact that basically, this wasn't about Hamas lobbing half a dozen fireworks into Israel. It was much more sinister than that. So, I mean, let me tell you, there are analysts working with the British and American governments who believe that Israel may actually disappear as a nation within the next 5 years. Now whether or not that actually occurs really depends on whether or not I think the Jewish people are able to gain control of their government, or whether it remains a Zionist entity. Because ostensibly, of course, it is a Rothschild Zionist entity. It's a Rothschild's nation. It might as well be called the state of Rothschilds rather than the state of Israel. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at how this global agenda is unfolding. John, I'm going to have to take the questions right at the end.
Would you just elaborate on the Rothschild influence in starting the state of Israel? Because I think that's really important.
Okay, listen, I am going to unfortunately have to skim over some aspects because we've got a lot of ground to cover. But the purpose of what I do really is to stimulate your own curiosity, because there is nothing that I'm sharing through the course of the day that you cannot find out for yourself. The role of the mainstream media, of course, is to tell people what to think. The role of the TV and the daily newspapers and the radio is to save people from having to make any effort in determining what's going on in the world. It's a case of feeding people their daily dose of bullshit, and that, of course, keeps the masses focused on, running on the hamster wheel. The role of the alternative community, and of course this is where John has made a major contribution. The role of the alternative media is simply to provide an opportunity for people to come to their own realization of what's occurring. And that's why one of the things I really like about Uncensored magazine, as of course, is the tagline is "Think for yourself." And the other thing that, of course, is unique about the alternative media is the alternative media will print articles, and at the bottom of the articles it'll have a whole bunch of web references where you can go and find out more information on the subject. You never read an article in the mainstream media where the journalist signs off saying, well, on the basis of my limited opportunity to research this material, that's my point of view, but go check it out for yourself. Because you're expected to literally take it as gospel. So, consequently, I would be mortified if anybody ever went away from one of my talks and said, Ian Crane says this or Ian Crane says that. Oh, they might. But I would hope that they actually went and checked it for themselves and came up with their own realization. So, unfortunately, by necessity, there's going to be some areas that I can only skim over. But let me start with this symbol. This is actually a piece of graffiti that appeared in New York a few months ago. This is actually when it was a work in progress, and I'll show you the finished product a little later. But it's very, very important that we understand the significance of this symbol, because this is the Great Seal. It's a representation, of course, of the Great Seal, which appears on the back of the $1 bill in this format. This is not working. See if that makes a little bit of difference. So this is the Great Seal, and unfortunately it's a bit too, we've got a bit too much ambient light here. But you see the separated capstone. And the separated capstone here is very, very important, because the separated capstone represents the knowledge and the wisdom of the few, never to be shared with the masses, and the masses being represented by the rest of the pyramid. And even symbolically, those who think they're the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom will never allow the capstone to be conjoined with the pyramid. Because what that would symbolize is that the knowledge and the wisdom retained by that inner sanctum would then be shared with the masses. And this was evidenced at the millennium on the Giza Plateau, when the Egyptian government decided they would milk the tourist opportunities of the millennium. And so they commissioned Jean-Michel Jarre to perform one of his soundlight spectaculars on the Giza Plateau. And the pièce de résistance of this was going to be the lowering of a gold capstone on the top of the Great Pyramid, on top of Cheops. But when the powers that be heard about this, they told the Egyptian government, they said, look, you can go ahead with the Jean-Michel Jarre thing, that's absolutely fine. But you are not going to be lowering a gold capstone on the top of the pyramid. Now, something very, very interesting happened on that night. It was a beautiful, crisp winter's night in Cairo, and Jean-Michel Jarre was, performing in front of literally thousands. And then at 11:30, a cloud literally came across Cairo and just sat over the Great Pyramid at 11:30, and it stayed there for an hour. And so that at 12:30 or 0:30 a.m. on the morning of January the 1st, 2000, the cloud moved away. And actually, in Robert Bouval's new book, The Master Game, he's actually included a photograph of somebody who was at that event. And on the photograph, it shows actually the eye in the pyramid being projected onto the cloud. So was a gold capstone lowered on the pyramid? Somehow I doubt it. But nonetheless, we don't actually know, because there was this cloud enveloping the whole of the pyramid. But that's the effort to which these guys will go to try and ensure that the capstone is never actually lowered on the pyramid. Now, the global corporatists, the banksters, have basically had an agenda to take control of the planet for a long, long time. And actually, what they're doing is quite simplistic in many, many respects. So, let me just ask you the question, how many people in the room have actually played a game of Monopoly at some time in their lives? Most people, okay. Most people play Monopoly. Okay, how many people have actually finished a game of Monopoly? Wow, that's amazing. God, life must be really boring here. Okay, for those of you who finished a game of Monopoly, keep your hand up if you won the game. Okay, now keep your hand up if you were the banker. Okay, well, let me tell you, the vast majority of games of Monopoly that do eventually go through to the ultimate culmination are won by the banker. Not that I'm casting any aspersions on the player who was the banker, but I can tell you that when I was the banker, it pretty much ensured that I was going to win the game. Because I had the luxury of controlling the distribution of the money to the other players. But more importantly, I had the opportunity to control the flow of money into my account. So if I was running a bit short of cash, then, every time I got past go, I might slip an extra couple of hundred in my direction rather than the 200 that I would be required to give everyone else. Well, of course, the game of Monopoly normally doesn't reach a conclusion, because what happens is after about 3 days, everyone gets bored, and there's an agreement that, look, we've been playing this for long enough, there's no sign of anybody winning, we'll simply add up how much money each of us have got, and we'll add up, how many houses and hotels that we've got, and whoever's got the most will be declared the winner. But of course, that is not the purpose of the game. The purpose of the game is literally the last man or woman standing. It's total ownership of the board. And the game goes through periods or phases, let's say. And the first phase is getting the game moving, the priming of the game. And of course, the game cannot start unless every player has a pot of money. I mean, if they didn't have that, then the game would last even longer, because there'd have to be a round where people could accumulate money to start playing the game. So fortunately, it's long enough already, so that's short-circuited by everybody being given money. The first round of the game is people buying up the various properties that they land on. So they use their pot of money that they've been given to buy up the various properties on the board. And of course they add to their funds as they go past go. They collect £200, they land on chance, a community chest, then they can get some extra income. And then of course as the other players land on the properties that they've purchased, they have to pay them rent. And then as they build up this pot of cash, they can use it to then build houses on these locations and then hotels. And once everybody has basically got all their locations loaded with houses and hotels, then the real game starts. And at this point forward, it's every player for themselves, and it is literally annihilation of the opponents by taking total ownership of the board. Well, that's the stage of the game that the bankers are in right now. They are going for total ownership of the board. They've basically got the US. They had the US a long time ago, but they've got it now. When George W. Bush came into office in 2001, January 2001, the US debt was a total of $2 trillion. $2 trillion. By the time he left office, he'd managed to increase the debt to $5 trillion. Barack Obama has taken it to $17 trillion. $17 trillion. And of course, hardly anybody in America really understands the magnitude of what he's done in terms of literally ensuring that the nation is destroyed. I mean, they will find out during this 4-year period, but that is what he's done. 17 trillions. Now don't get too smug, because I'm going to show you what's going on in New Zealand in a little while. And I can assure you that what I'm going to show you, for many of you, will come as a shock. The banksters own Greece. Although they've stripped everything they really want out of it now, so they're basically going to throw the leftovers back to the Greek people at some point. But they've asset stripped it. They've stripped it bare. Greece today basically no longer exists as a nation. The guy who is in charge of Greece was appointed ostensibly by the European Central Bank, a former associate at Goldman Sachs. Italy, the elected leader of the country, Silvio Berlusconi, of course one can argue that he presented his head on the silver platter, but nonetheless, he has been replaced, not by an election, but by an appointee of the European Central Bank, Mario Monti, a former associate of Goldman Sachs. Ireland no longer exists. The Irish people gave away their country. I mean, we can actually trace the exact moment that they gave away the country. It was at a meeting on September 28, 2008, when the two senior politicians, Brian Cowen, the Prime Minister, and his Chancellor, Brian Lenihan, were instructed by 3 Bilderbergers, all Irishmen, by birth, by passport, but globalists, but 3 Bilderbergers, and they were told to effectively underwrite all the liabilities of the Irish banks by the taxpayer. At that point, Ireland was history. It was done, it was dusted. The Greeks rioting in the streets of Athens are wearing T-shirts that say, "We are not Irish." It's become an insult in Europe to be labelled Irish, because the Irish just gave away their country. But that's perhaps the benefit, as far as the banksters are concerned, of 40 years of fluoride in your water supply. 40 years of fluoride, and the Irish government 40 years ago took advice from the US military. And so consequently, of course, there are a few people in Ireland that are desperately trying to salvage whatever they can of their nation and call their politicians to account, but the bottom line is there's not enough. So here we are, a country that basically was assimilated into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1800. At that point, the Irish nation was so indebted to the British government, to the British banks, that the Irish government saw no other way forward other than to effectively dissolve the Irish Parliament and hand the nation over to Westminster. So in 1800, Ireland ceased to exist as a nation and was assimilated into the UK. The British landowners moved in and bought up the land in Ireland at cents on the punt, forcing the Irish to live as peasants. 40 years later, in 1840, the Irish peasants, who had been forced to live on an effective diet of potatoes, were effectively either killed or shipped out of the country because the British landowners refused to make the produce from the farms available to the Irish people. Of course, British history talks about a terrible, terrible famine in Ireland. There was no famine in Ireland. There was no famine at all. How do we know that? Because we have the shipping manifest, thanks to a wonderful Irish historian by the name of Raymond Crotty. So we have the shipping manifest of all the produce that was being shipped out of Ireland in that period to be resold in the British Empire. Because the British landowners, of course, realised that they could get way more money by shipping the produce overseas and selling it to in the various colonies rather than making it available to the Irish people. So the Irish people either starved or, of course, they were put on board the ships to go over to the New World. It took the Irish until 1922 to get sovereignty. And that only came about after the 1916 uprising, which was led by the working classes of Ireland. But of course that uprising was brutally shut down. The only reason that the Irish got their sovereignty back in 1922 was because the middle classes realised that basically they were going to be fleeced of everything that they had worked hard to accumulate, coupled with which the British government in 1917 told the Irish middle classes that they wanted their sons to be conscripted and go fight in the trenches of the First World War. So the combination of these two factors meant that the Irish middle classes actually got off their butts and led the revolution. Of course, the working classes were right there behind them. I mean, they were just waiting for a bit of leadership. And so in 1922, the Irish nation re-established national sovereignty. And in less than 90 years, they've given it away. Just given it away. I mean, the leaders of the uprisings, you know, the likes of Michael Collins and even Raymond Crotty, who's an Irish historian from the 1970s and 80s, you know, these guys will be turning in their graves at the way the people have effectively just given away their independence. So now we need to be taking a look at what's going on elsewhere in the world. Because up until just 5 years ago, the vast majority of people believed that the days of boom and bust were over, and that the world was in a state of perpetual economic growth. Well, there were some of us, of course, who saw through that charade, and we don't claim any special insight. We simply knew history. Because it didn't take a rocket scientist to realise that what had been going on basically since 2002 through to 2006, 2007 was exactly the same as what had been occurring in the 1920s. And then, of course, in 1929, the Federal Reserve effectively initiated the crash. And we know it was planned because Bernard Baruch, who was one of the architects of the crash, advised his good friend and buddy Winston Churchill that he better start taking care over where he had his wealth invested, because the Federal Reserve was about to crash the American economy. And we were in exactly the same situation in 2006, 2007. Iceland, in 2007, was declared by Forbes magazine to be the wealthiest nation on the planet per capita. But a year later, their economy had totally collapsed. Totally collapsed. Now let me give you an example or a comparison as to Iceland calling it or being declared the wealthiest nation on the planet. That's like any one of us going to the bank and asking the bank to lend us $10 trillion. And the bank saying, yeah, absolutely, here you go, $10 trillion. And then you walking outside and declaring yourself to be the richest person in New Zealand. It's not real. It's not real. And that was exactly the same in Iceland. And in fact, the chief executive officer of Danske Bank went over to Iceland in early 2007 and basically told the Icelandic bankers that unless they changed their behavior, unless they changed the way they did business, they were heading for an absolutely catastrophic meltdown. And the guy was booed off stage by the Icelandic bankers. And when he was invited to come back to the country 6 months later, the government refused to allow him into the country because they didn't want this harbinger of doom, this bearer of bad tidings, to burst their bubble. But of course, a little over a year and a half later, everything he had told the Icelandic community, the government and the banks, came to pass. And when it crashed in totality. And of course, the first thing that happened was that the banks wanted the government to bail them out. Well, fortunately, the government didn't react immediately. And the women of Iceland saw where this was going. So the women of Iceland took to the streets. Now, Reykjavik is about as big as Grey Lynn. And so when the women hit the streets in Reykjavik with their pots and their pans, and they just started hitting the pots and pans, it was impossible for anybody to work. And the government realized that this wasn't a one-day protest. We'll talk more about protest action a bit later. But this wasn't a one-day protest, because one-day protests are totally ineffectual. Nobody gives a damn about one-day protests, especially when they're on the weekend. But this wasn't a one-day protest. This was every day from dawn, basically, until dusk, start of the working day to the end of the working day. And eventually the government resigned. And when they held elections, hardly any one of the sitting politicians got re-elected. And a lot of people who'd never even considered entering politics before put themselves forward. And the vast majority of the newly elected politicians were women. The attitude in Iceland basically was that the men fucked it up and the women were going to have to put it right. And there really is a hell of a lot of truth in this. A hell of a lot of truth. The women had a couple of absolutely major advantages over the men. The first one was that they knew nothing about banking. Well, clearly the men didn't either, but the women didn't even pretend to know anything about banking. But the other thing that they had to their advantage was that they had no old school tie connections, no good old boy network. They were true sovereign independents. They realized that individually, none of them had the skills, the knowledge, the experience to be able to resolve this issue. So the first thing they did was introduce a law which protected whistleblowers, because they wanted the whistleblowers to step forward, especially those obviously who worked in the banking industry, but they didn't restrict the law to just banking. But they wanted people who'd had experience in the banking industry to come forward and explain to them how this event had been perpetrated, how the banking system had been allowed to crash, and how the government basically had just sat by and watched. By the way, Iceland is still the only country that has taken its bankers to court and imprisoned them. The women of Ireland also made a couple of other very, very important observations, because when they realized the magnitude of the event, they realized, of course, that basically the whole economy was shut down. So people just didn't have a way of earning money. And of course, we know what that can lead to. So the women made two very important announcements. They said that no one was going to lose their home because of what had been perpetrated by the banks. So in the last 4 years, guess how many people have been evicted through foreclosure of their property for non-payment of their mortgage? A big fat zero. In the UK last year, 58,000 people lost their homes. In this year, it's estimated that 75,000 people will lose their homes. In the US, those numbers are just not available anymore. I can tell you that in Florida, 200,000 people are not paying their mortgages, but more of that later. So the women said that no one would be kicked out of their home, no one would starve. And the third observation they made was that we are genuinely all in this together. Now, there was a couple of other people in the country shortly after the elections who'd come to the country to actually investigate how this had come about. And one was a guy called John Perkins. Anybody heard this name before? Yeah. Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins. And he'd come to the country because, of course, in his past life, he used to work for an agency called Maine, which was effectively a front company for the World Bank. And his job was to get developing nations, particularly developing nations with large natural resources, and his job was to get those countries into debt so they could effectively, the banks could then effectively take over the country through, bankrupting the country. And John Perkins acknowledges in the first chapter of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, in fact in the opening paragraph, that there are two South American presidents that were assassinated because he was unable to persuade them to buy into his proposition to get their countries into debt. And one of them, which was Omar Torrijos, actually said to him, John, you're a young man, as he was at the time. He said, John, you're a young man, and one day you will understand how this game is played. But today you are a puppet. And of course, with the benefit of much hindsight, he realizes that that's absolutely true. So, the guy certainly has a lot of contrition for what he was doing in his earlier life. But on the other hand, had he not done that, and then ultimately written the book, by the way, he was paid $1 million a year for nearly 20 years not to write the book. But the events of 9/11 changed his mind on that, and he decided the book had to be written. It took him another 4.5 years to find a publisher. And when he did find a publisher, the book went straight into the New York Times bestsellers list, where it remained for 75 weeks. Fortunately for him, because it was that visibility that's probably kept him alive. So he was in Iceland to see for himself what had brought about the Icelandic collapse, and of course he realized as soon as he got there that it was the same template. Basically, it was encouraging the Icelandic government to invest in the Alcoa plant and this massive dam project in the middle of Iceland for generating hydroelectricity, which they didn't need. And this is the basic model in terms of getting countries into debt, by proposing projects that are extremely expensive, will burden them with debt, but they don't really need them anyway. So the likelihood of the project actually generating any revenue to be able to repay the loan is slim to none. So the women of Iceland, they called in John, and the other guy that they discovered was in Iceland was a guy called Bill Still. Anybody heard of Bill Still? Yeah? Money Masters fame. He wrote Money Masters, I think, in 1995, 96. And, it's really in the last few years that, of course, that work has really come into its own. So the women called them in to talk to them, and between them they came up with a game plan to reignite the Icelandic economy. And do you know what the model for reigniting the Icelandic economy was? The game of Monopoly, but in a slightly different form. Now remember I said, of course, that the game of Monopoly actually gets started when everybody is given a pot of money. Well, in Iceland they decided they didn't just want to give people money, but they wanted to get money into the economy. So what they did was they got all of the community leaders, like the local council leaders, to draw up lists of community projects. So this could be anything from sort of filling potholes in the road, digging trenches for the utilities, painting the houses of the elderly, or digging the gardens of the handicapped, anything. A whole bunch of projects. And they said, look, if you want money, then you come forward and you pick up one of these projects. So there's no benefits apart from obviously the people that were, you know, incapable through health. But there was no social security. If you wanted money, if you wanted to be able to access the new barter economy, then you had to sign up for one of these projects. So regardless of what your background was, regardless of what position you may or may not have held before the collapse, if you wanted money, you went and signed up for one of these projects, and all these projects paid exactly the same, you know, an hourly rate of whatever, but everybody got exactly the same. But what it did, and those projects are still available for people who haven't got other employment. And what this is doing is this is putting money into the economy. Now, if a businessman wants to borrow money, he can do so. He can borrow money from the People's Bank of Iceland. And the money then is obviously lent. And when it's repaid and the interest is repaid, it comes back to the people. So the people can then use that money for infrastructure projects. They don't have to borrow it from somebody else. And this is absolutely remarkable. And this is the basis of Iceland being able to re-establish an economy and actually get it into growth mode in what is effectively just under 4 years since it went into total collapse. But how much, you know, it's such a remarkable story that, of course, your newspapers have been full of it, haven't they? You mean it hasn't been on the front pages here? Well, no great surprise, because it hasn't been on the front pages anywhere.
So effectively they started their own reserve bank.
Yes. And by the way, there was a model already in place. And that model, anyone want to hazard a guess where the model came from? No. John?
Germany.
No. Although Germany was a form of under Hitler, yeah. But no, there's a model in place that even predates Hitler's barter economy of the 1930s.
I can't remember the name of the island, but it was somewhere off England and it was a private...
Oh, Guernsey, no. Or Jersey, rather, no. It wasn't Jersey. No, it was North Dakota. North Dakota. You know, one of the things about democracy is the easiest system of government to manipulate and control. That's why they want democracy. But in its current form, because it wasn't always this way. So I'm going to do something about this microphone. It wasn't, oh, that's off completely. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It wasn't always this way. Up until the late 19th, early 20th century, the democracies of the USA and the UK, and I don't know about Australia and New Zealand, you'll have to tell me, but basically, MPs weren't salaried. The only way in which you could become a member of Parliament was to prove that you had sufficient means of private income to be able to sit in service to the community. The reason for that was because the view at the time was that if you were of private means, you were less susceptible to corruption. And the banksters realised this. And this actually is what happened with North Dakota. Because by definition, the vast majority of people who entered into public office, because they were of private means, some of course it was legacy money, but for most of them, particularly in the US, it was because they had created the wealth. And so they were pretty smart. And they knew how the system worked. That's why the banksters kept making attempts to establish a central bank, a Federal Reserve, and kept failing because people in US government, in the House and in the Senate, knew what they were doing. And so they'd get it in, they'd manage to manipulate it into law, and then it would get shut down. So the current iteration of the Federal Reserve in the United States, which is 99 years old this December, but the current iteration was the fourth attempt by the banksters to establish control of the US economy. The previous 3 attempts were shut down because the elected representatives knew how the system worked and knew that if they allowed it to continue, then basically the US would no longer exist in the format that the Founding Fathers had intended. So that's why the banksters, through the 19 teens and the 20s, put pressure on the various governments to start the process of allowing anybody to stand for elected office and to make those positions salaried. Because if you could start getting people into public office who didn't have private means, then they were much easier to manipulate. Because all you had to show them was how deep the trough was, and then all you had to do was find out how deep they were prepared to put their snout into it. And let me tell you that nobody gets into high public office today unless they are regarded as a safe pair of hands, which normally means that there is something that they have in the closet that can be used against them. In Tony Blair's case, in 1983, in Bow Street Magistrates Court in London, a certain Charles Linton was charged with cottaging and found guilty of cottaging. Now, cottaging is a very old British legal term for importuning in gentlemen's toilets. So seeking same-sex partners in men's public toilets. Charles Linton was bound over to keep the peace for 2 years and fined for cottaging. The full name of the former British Prime Minister is Tony Charles Linton Blair. That's how they got Tony Blair right where they wanted him. And, you know, you have to dig deep sometimes, but, you know, when you know that there is a skeleton, then fortunately, with the access to information that we have today, eventually somebody is going to dig deep enough and find it. So it's in these guys' interest, obviously, to take control and also to make sure that nobody really understands how this system works. So what I'm going to do before we take the first break is, I think we're going to do a little bit of education here. Can you put your hands up? How many people have heard the term fractional reserve banking? Okay, now, let me tell you this. 5 years ago, if I'd have asked that same question, I doubt many of you would have put your hands up. Some of you would, but not very many. Now put your hands up if you could come up here and give a 5-minute explanation of how fractional reserve banking works. Okay, yep. Now that's the sort of number 5 years ago would have said they'd heard of the term. I can pretty much guarantee that within a year, maybe less, probably, actually hopefully 20 minutes, every one of you will be able to put your hand up and say that you've got an insight into how fractional reserve banking works. Now if you go into your local bank, and walk up to the counter and just say, you know, just out of interest, could you explain to me fractional reserve banking? What? They're not going to have a clue what you're talking about. I doubt they will have even heard the term. But if you persist, and they'll say, well, maybe I'll get the manager. Well, now this is when things get really interesting. Because the manager won't have a clue. Because within the finance sector, they don't want people to understand the way fractional reserve banking works, because if they did, they might realize that they're participating in a massive fraud and a Ponzi scheme. So they're not taught. And by the way, at the London School of Economics, if you are studying for your PhD, you cannot get your PhD, you will not be awarded your PhD if you put forward any alternative to the fractional reserve banking system. So this is how the whole thing is controlled. And the fastest way to get kicked out of your PhD course is to indicate that you actually have a soft spot for Islamic banking. Because Islamic banking is the absolute anathema to fractional reserve banking, which is one of the reasons that Gaddafi, more of which later, had to be taken out. Anyway, I'm going to just share with you a statement that appeared on a website about 18 months ago now. And the website, you can't see it here, but it's SHTF Plan. SHTF Plan, which stands for shithitthefan.plan.com. Now, the journalist here, his real name's not Marco Salvo. He uses various anagrams of his real name. But he wrote this, he said, when this Ponzi scheme finally comes down, it will be unlike anything we've ever seen in terms of economic collapse and financial asset annihilation. And this wasn't any great foresight, because that's basically reporting what had happened in Greece and Ireland already and is now well on the way to happening in Spain. And the people of Catalonia, of course, are beginning to realise that they're going to get sucked down into a black hole, and that's why the people of Catalonia are now seeking succession from Spain. Marco continues, he says, it turns out there are whistleblowers, hundreds of them, but any attack on the establishment is met with either a full-on counterattack that targets the credibility of the individual bringing forth the information and marginalises the content of the message by dismissing it as the ravings of a lunatic or disgruntled employee, or it's simply erased from public view by the very institutions tasked with investigating such activity. And when we open the second half, I would show you a film clip now, but I'm not actually sure that the sound's going to work, so I want to test that out in the break. But I'm going to show you a very short clip that appeared on the BBC once and once only, which absolutely epitomises what Marco has said here. Because a whistleblower went onto TV, and then the media went into absolute overdrive to demonise and dismiss him. I mean, it's a total character assassination. That guy's become a good friend of mine. He was one of the guys I invited to speak at the Financial Terrorism Exposed events that I put on in Ireland and the UK earlier this year. John Perkins was also one of the speakers there. So the bankers know that obviously what they've got to do is make sure that nobody really understands how this system works. Because once people start understanding, then the first thing that you're going to do is actually get your money out of the banks. And let me tell you that right now, the only thing that you should have in your bank is an overdraft. And preferably a very, very big one. But I'm going to share with you what you would do with that overdraft as well. But let's talk about the fractional reserve banking for a second, because this is actually obviously crucial to everything that we are talking about here. Now, the thing about fractional reserve banking is that it is absolutely brilliant. Take nothing away from these guys. It's brilliant. We can trace it back. I mean, there may be earlier elements of it, but we can actually trace it back to 1604, when it was introduced by the Bank of Amsterdam. It actually came into the UK in 1694 with the arrival of William of Orange. So he bought it from Amsterdam. This is, of course, a little piece of history that no Brits are aware of. That's the point at which Britain effectively became part of the Dutch Empire. But anyway, that's an aside. So that's how we got Dutch fractional reserve banking into the UK, and then, of course, from there, over the next 400 plus years, it was spread throughout the world as the bankers took control. And people have realized this, and when the American politicians, I think it was Andrew Jackson, said there are two ways to enslave a nation. One is with the sword, the other one is with debt. This is so amazing. It's actually better than alchemy. Because with alchemy, you need at least a base product. Whether that's the physical alchemy of lead into gold, or the metaphysical alchemy of starting with the sort of the ego self and the evolution through that process. But with fractional reserve banking, you actually don't need anything at all. As somebody said to me the other day, didn't Dire Straits try and tell us something about that? I'm not going to sing it. Well, all you need to start this process is an act of law giving you, me in this example as the banker, the opportunity to establish a central bank. So in 1913, Woodrow Wilson was pressurized by the banking cabal led by JP Morgan, Junius Pierpont Morgan. Of course, Junius Pierpont Morgan had managed to get rid of all of the opposition that he had in the Senate at that time by basically giving them free tickets to a ship that was shortly going to leave from the UK and not make it all the way back to the US. So coincidentally, all the opposition from the Senate to the proposition to establish the Federal Reserve in the US were on board the Titanic. Which of course was a JP Morgan scam, which you'll be very well aware of if you read an edition of Uncensored about 2 editions ago. One of the earliest conspiracy theories. Why do you think the Titanic's never going to be raised? Ever. Because it wasn't the Titanic, exactly. So, having got rid of all the opposition, and now I am at liberty to establish my central bank. Now, when the Federal Reserve was set up, the original agreement was that it had some assets, that it had some physical assets. Well, it might have had some, but you know what it did? It actually printed a bunch of money, gave it to the US government, and then the US government effectively, or lent it to the US government, didn't give it at all. It lent it to the US government, and then the US government deposited it back in the bank, and they claimed that was their asset base on which to start. So right from the get-go, they were charging interest on their non-existent assets, and that capital of non-existent assets and the interest was going to be paid by the American taxpayer. And up until that point, there was no income tax in the US. So the establishment of the central bank goes hand in glove with the arrival of income tax. But I've got to get this rolling. So however it is that I raise my capital, in this example I've got 1 million to play with. In other words, I've either written it on a ledger in biro or I've put it into a spreadsheet. But I can't do much with 1 million. So I'm going to use a fractional reserve ratio of 5 to 1. And I'm going to multiply my non-existent 1 million by 5. So now I've got 5 million to play with. But I can't really do much. I mean, this is a big economy we've got to take control of here. So I'm going to phone a couple of my banking buddies, like the Warburgs, and I'm going to encourage them to help me here and set up a couple of regional banks. But even with the regional banks, we still need something at the sharp end to get the money into the community. So we'll phone a few more buddies and we'll start to establish some high street banks for the purpose of this example. So now I'm going to put the money that doesn't exist and I'm going to spread it around these banks. So I'm basically going to give them 1 million each. But these banks are going to be more aggressive with their fractional reserve ratio, and they're going to multiply this 1 million that doesn't really exist by 10. So they've now created 10 million to play with. And the same at the high street level. They're going to use a fractional reserve ratio at 10, and these regional banks are going to lend these high street banks money, so they're going to pump some money in there. So now, from my 1 million, which didn't really exist in the first place, just in this very simple example, I've created 70 million to start being pumped into the economy. Now, when it gets really outrageous is when this bank lends 1 million back to this bank, who multiply it by 10, and then lend 1 million back to this bank and multiply it by 10. You see how the money supply becomes actually unlimited? And every single dollar that goes into circulation, somebody somewhere owes interest on it. There is no money in circulation, basically, that somebody somewhere doesn't owe interest on, unless it's in gold and silver. Now, we've got to get the money into the economy. So there's 3 ways in which we do this, and I've talked about getting governments into debt, and the most recent, most obvious example of that was this. Seen this before? Well, I used to live in Dubai when the current ruler's father was still alive, and the current ruler's father, Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum, was a visionary And he was also the guy who recognized that the oil was a gift from Allah and not to be squandered. And so consequently, he was managing the growth of Dubai very carefully. But when he died and his son took over, the World Bank flew the equivalent of John Perkins in and said, we've got a great idea for you. We've got an absolutely amazing idea. You know, how about we present you with a project that will enable you to leave your mark on your country, and it can be such an amazing mark that it can be seen from outer space. And initially he said, well, nice idea, but you know, it's a bit of a stretch in terms of our financial resources. And they said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll lend you the money. But of course the money never actually goes to the country. The money goes to the companies like Halliburton, Kellogg Brown and Root, Bechtel, and all the other American companies who were going to do the project, build the project. Well, so this was finished in 2007. You know, 8-star hotels or whatever here, luxury villas around here on all the fronds, and they were just about to be marketed to the world's nouveau riche when the global financial collapse kicked into play. And the World Bank turned up to Dubai and they said to the young Maktoum, God, that's a bit of a shame. God damn. Who could have ever seen that coming? Wow, you've got a bit of a problem, haven't you? You owe us a shed load of money. How are you going to pay it back? Oh, I know. You've got oil. And I think at that moment, the young Maktoum realized that he'd been stitched up like a proverbial kipper. He got lucky. He got very, very lucky. Dubai is not a nation. Dubai is an emirate within the United Arab Emirates. The leader of the United Arab Emirates is his neighbor in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Zayed. Well, Zayed's father got stitched up by the bankers when they deliberately collapsed BCCI in 1991. And Zayed took personal responsibility. Zayed, although he wasn't able to pay back everything that people lost, but he made a pledge to try to reimburse as many of the account holders of BCCI as he possibly could. And of course, information came out later in the 90s that the Bank of England knew this was happening and effectively helped to accelerate the collapse of BCCI. And the reason was because they wanted to destroy the middle classes of India and Pakistan, who were the primary investors in BCCI at the time. So Zayed knew the game that was going on here. Zayed had no intention of allowing the World Bank to take control of any element of the United Arab Emirates resources, so he bailed out the young Maktoum. And I'm sure the terms, were somewhat more attractive than those that were going to be proposed by the World Bank, which was effectively ownership of Dubai's resources. So that's how a nation is got into hock. Businesses are got into hock. 20 years ago, if a business wanted to expand, it would do so on the basis that it had a really good year, the market was buoyant, there was demand for the products, and it would keep back some of the profits to use to invest to extend the business. What the bankers have done over the last 20 years is they've demonized businesses that do that, and they call it retained profits. And of course what they do is they tell shareholders that the business should be paying out more in dividends, but it's not, because it's hoarding profit. Hoarding profit. And so what the bankers have done is created a situation where businesses are scared to use profit to expand the business. The only way in which they can expand is to borrow. And of course what happens is the business gets itself overextended in terms of loans, the market comes down, the bank come in, foreclose on the business, and they either sell the business on to a conglomerate or they asset strip it. On an individual level, and you're told right in your face what's going on when you get the mortgage. And do you know what the word mortgage means?
Death grip.
Death grip, exactly. Actually, the direct translation is death pledge, but the colloquial is death grip. And once upon a time, this was the first point at which a young person effectively got themselves snared by the banksters. But of course, there's been efforts in the Western world over the last 20 years to bring that forward with student loans. And in the US, if you go bankrupt, you cannot include your student loan in your bankruptcy. Your student loan goes with you to your grave. Well, and that's deliberate because in the occult belief system, these guys believe that if you die with debt, you will actually, when you reincarnate, you will also find yourself in debt. Whether that's true or not, but that's what they believe. That's why they want to perpetrate this permanent debt, i.e. it's a debt in perpetuity. But you see how the game works here? Yeah? It's about total ensnarement. And they've been literally working on this, for many hundreds of years, one might argue even millennia. But the game has really kicked into place since August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon was instructed to take the US dollar off the gold standard. And so literally, the travesty of everything that's occurred and is in process of occurring has all been really since August the 15th, 1971. So we are literally in a situation where the world has been brought to its knees in 41 years. And the game is accelerating at a phenomenal rate of knots. And despite the fact that Europe is rioting, Europe is going into sort of phases of general strike, anywhere else in the world people are going, oh, no, don't want to see that, oh, no, don't want to see that. Just ignore it and it'll go away. Well, it isn't going away. And whereas people in Greece and Ireland, their naivety caught them out, for everywhere else in the world there's no excuse. And because of the way these guys work, and again, their belief system is that when they tell us what it is they're going to do, and we do nothing, they take it as a mandate to go ahead with their agenda. And everything that I've been sharing with you, they're putting out in the media. I only arrived here in New Zealand yesterday, late last night, so I haven't had a chance to see the New Zealand press. But in Australia, the media, particularly the financial media, is actually telling people we're on the brink of collapse. In Queensland, people are, because Queensland had a particular case where the government was pumping money in to get people onto the housing ladder, people were falling for it. Because everyone in the market knew that the government was funding these first-time buyers coming into the market, house prices went up. Now that incentive is no longer available, house prices are crashing. So people are finding themselves in enormous levels of negative equity. Now in Florida, I mentioned earlier, 200,000 people are not paying their mortgages. When one person doesn't pay their mortgage, they are demonized as a pariah to society. When 200,000 people are not paying their mortgage, that's a serious movement. And you're not reading anything about that in the media either, are you? Nor is anybody in the US, because the banks and the loan companies don't want people to know that if there is a serious movement of non-payment of mortgage, i.e. non-compliance, there's actually not very much they can do about it.
Are they not paying anything?
No. Zero. No, zero. But what happened is that the Florida housing market is has been dependent pretty much all along on retirees from the northeastern states in particular, where it's bloody cold, coming down to Florida and Arizona. So they sell up in the northeast. Property prices in the northeast are much higher than they are in Florida, primarily because properties in the northeast are brick built, properties in Florida are on a concrete slab and wood frame buildings, so they're much cheaper. So when these retirees retire and they sell up their property in the northeast, they can come down to Florida, buy a really nice property, relatively cheap price, and they've still got a nice pot of money to live on. But because the property market crashed in 2007, then we had the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, which basically, people were moving to Florida for their health. Well, after BP Deepwater Horizon, the last place you'd move on Earth to for your health is Florida. So the property prices just absolutely tanked. Absolutely tanked. So people just said, what? We're not paying the mortgage. And of course, this all came together through the social networks. This is internet connectivity. And what they've done is they've worked on the basis, because in the US, you miss one mortgage payment, the banks apply for foreclosure. And the bailiffs come in, strip your house, put all your furniture and personal effects on the sidewalk, and then they padlock and board up the house. The statistics in America right now are just outrageous. I mean, there's something like 18 million homeless in the US and 43 million empty properties. And what they're doing is, in many cities, they are now bulldozing empty properties, supposedly because of vermin infestation. But of course, what they're just doing is making sure that nobody can go and live there. Of course it's terrible. It gets worse, by the way. They're actually preventing people in the US and in Greece. They're preventing charities from feeding people that are homeless.
So from a certain point of view, they are preventing vermin infestation.
Develop later. Agenda 21. Absolutely, it is Agenda 21. Everything here we're talking about really is focused on Agenda 21. So the reality is here that mass non-compliance is something these guys don't know how to deal with. And that's why they're absolutely desperate to prevent people knowing what happened in Iceland and prevent people from, even in the US, knowing what's going on in Florida. And obviously, what they don't want to do is they don't want to give people the idea that there is another way in which, you know, we can exist within this economic framework. But, you know, the good news is that as this does get worse, as you guys have illustrated here, because, you know, the whole room pretty much has heard the term fractional reserve banking, now every one of you has at least got a basic insight. Everything I've told you here is absolutely factually correct. Okay, it was simplistic, but it's factually correct. So every one of you has now got a little more of an insight into the way the system works. And what's going to happen over the coming weeks and months is that more and more people are going to start to understand. And this scares the crap out of the banksters. Now, this isn't a black or white situation. I mean, I'm not necessarily anticipating that the whole banking system collapses. But eventually, when the bankers realize that enough people understand how this is occurring and they risk mass non-compliance with non-payment of mortgages, they'll come to the table. You know, and there's probably some middle ground that we might have to work through between, you know, what exists today and what Iceland has implemented. Because, you know, I certainly would acknowledge it's a lot easier to implement it in a nation of 300,000 people than it is of 17 million or 56 million or 300 million. So this is the first part where we're looking at, you know, what's occurring in the physical empirical material realm. And obviously there are things that we can do to avoid getting caught up in this. Because that's what they want. They want people to go, oh my God, I'm just going to ignore it. Or I've just got to keep my nose to the grindstone and hope that it doesn't catch up with me. Well, what we're going to talk about in the second session is the ways in which we can actually or steps that we could take to avoid getting caught up in it. Because if we are caught up in it, it means that potentially we're going to end up spending every minute of every day foraging, you know, doing whatever it is that we need to do to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table, which means that then we're not really effective in terms of any kind of opposition. So what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we've taken care of the basics so that we can actually focus on bringing about the changes that we know we need to see. So on that note, let's take a half-hour break. And let's be back here for 3:15, yeah? Thank you. It is amazing how we are brought together with people who, for whatever reason, either we need to learn something from them or vice versa. And the plane trip yesterday from Sydney to Auckland was absolutely no different. So there was I thinking I was going to sit on the plane and catch a couple of hours sleep. Little did I know that there was another plans afoot. Oops. I think this is a bit too loud, so isn't it? A bit too loud. Okay. All right, so as John said, what we're going to do is the day is going to be broken down into 3, maybe 4 parts. We'll see how we roll. I'll try and make sure that I'm not speaking for more than about 90 minutes at any one time, absolute max, before we take a break. It'll be between 75 and 90 minutes. It just depends how many tangents I go off on during the course of each session. The first break, I'm assuming that everyone's had some lunch, yes? Yeah, right. So the first break, is really just going to be a short comfort break, time to grab a quick coffee. Fortunately, there's a number of coffee options down the road, so not everyone's going to be piling into one shop, I hope. It'll only be a coffee break. It'll be a maximum of about half an hour or so. And then the second break's probably going to get us to dinner. I mean, you can tell me whether it's dinner time or not. I'm not sure what the custom here is. If I'm talking in the US, they want to take dinner at 5:30. If I'm talking in the UK, they don't want it till 7:30. So you tell me when's a good time to take it. And the day's very much going to be broken into two parts. The first part, which is really the first two sessions, I'm going to focus very much on what's going on in the physical realm, in the physical, empirical, material realm. Everything that we can see going on. And talk a little bit about why it's occurring, what the agenda is, and basically how it's going to unfold, or how the perpetrators of this agenda, media, have picked up on that, and now they want to interview me because what do I think is going to happen on the apocalypse? But of course, they're expecting me to say something which they're going to be very disappointed, because I'm going to say something very, very different from what they're hoping that I will say, because they're looking for the sensational interview. Conspiracy theorist predicts end of world. But it isn't going to happen. That isn't going to be what we're talking about. And when we see what's going on right now, right across the world, we see people starting to wake up to the lies and the deceit. It shouldn't come as any great surprise to those of us that are following how this agenda is unfolding, that both in the UK and in Australia right now, we have major revelations in terms of the behavior and the morality and the integrity of those who think they are in leadership positions, whether that be in politics or aristocracy or whatever. And so the parallel society is getting exposed. The Zionist agenda is becoming exposed. Over the last few weeks, we have literally seen a massive sea change in the Western world, in the Western media. We still see the apologists for the Zionist agenda trotting out their articles, but you don't have to search too hard once you get onto the internet, onto the social media, onto the alternative press. You don't have to search too hard to see that basically people have had enough, and they're not going to be dismissed by being labelled as anti-Semitic, Holocaust deniers, or self-hating Jews. People are starting to say, hang on a goddamn second, there's something not quite right here. And of course, including the Jewish people themselves. Because the Jewish people are beginning, there've always been some of course, but the Jewish people en masse are starting to wake up to the fact that the Zionists are using them as a shield. And in fact, one of the most outstanding books written on this subject could only have ever been written by a Jewish historian. It's a guy called Ilan Pappé. Funnily enough, he can't live in Israel. So today he has a tenure at Exeter University in the southwest of England. And he wrote a book a few years ago, I think about 5 years ago now, maybe 6 years ago, and it is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. If anybody else had written that, if a Gentile had written that book, they would have been demonized. But because this guy is a Jewish historian, and in that book he names names, points to dates and meetings, and he basically makes the observation, he said, if there is anybody who thinks that the Zionists will stop before they have achieved the total ethnic cleansing of the Arab population from that area of the Middle East, and ultimately their goal is to establish Greater Israel, i.e. everything from the Nile to the Euphrates, as per the vision of Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. But the Jewish people themselves are now starting to realize that this is not in their best interests. So one of the reasons that the ceasefire has been called is because the Zionist government was being made aware that it was perpetrating a major PR own goal, or in danger of perpetrating it, as the world sort of woke up to the fact that basically, this wasn't about Hamas lobbing half a dozen fireworks into Israel. It was much more sinister than that. So I mean, there are, let me tell you, there are analysts working with the British and American governments who believe that Israel may actually disappear as a nation within the next 5 years. You know, now whether or not that actually occurs really depends on whether or not, I think, plan for it to unfold. That doesn't mean to say it will unfold. These people don't always get it their own way. So could we just turn it down a tad? It's just, I think it's a bit too loud. You better show me which one it is, actually. Okay, right. Okay, don't get too close to it with the mic on.
Just don't face it with the mic.
Sorry?
Just don't face it with the mic.
Yeah, exactly. I'll switch it off. Okay. So this first part, we're going to be looking at the things that you can see. I mean, I think there are a lot of people, particularly in Australia, less so in New Zealand it should be, but in Australia there's a lot of people who really don't see that they're heading for a massive cliff edge. You know, here you're a lot closer to the cliff edge than in Australia. And of course, there are a lot of people in New Zealand who have seen that cliff edge and they're leaving the country. And I think it was last year that it was a record year for people leaving New Zealand. I think it was 40,000 people that left New Zealand last year. I mean, you know, New Zealand, like Ireland, has a tradition of manning the world with its expatriates. So, you know, you can pretty much go anywhere in the world and you'll find an Irish community, and you'll normally find an Australian and New Zealand community as well. Well, these are the people that perhaps have seen what's coming and decided that, you know, maybe it's better to get out before the ship goes down and try and seek their fortune or whatever elsewhere. It doesn't have to be this way, but it means that people have got to actually wake up to what's occurring, and it's only when people know the rules of the game that they can actually start to comprehend what's occurring and then maybe start to work on trying to find the solutions to avoid getting caught up in the worst of the excess. But in the second half of the day, we're going to change tack completely. And I'm going to sort of develop on something I just touched on the last time I was here. And the core of my presentation really is building on Einstein's observation, which was that we're not going to solve problems by using the same thought processes that got us into them. And what I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to give you the evidence that leads me to believe that those who think they're the rightful rulers of this planetary fiefdom are running very, very scared. They're running very scared. They've given us clues, and when we start to put the pieces of the jigsaw together, and we look at what it is that they're doing to try and prevent what they fear occurring, then, you know, things might fall into place. So by the end of the day, what I hope we manage to achieve is one, I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about you will be aware of, either all or certainly parts of it, and hopefully what I'm doing is sort of pulling it all together and putting it into the bigger picture for you. But hopefully in the second half of the day, what we're going to start to look at is not just solutions that we can address on the physical realm, but maybe some things that we can do outside of the physical realm. Because that's the area that I believe that those who think they're the rightful rulers of the planet are very, very concerned about. And right now we're in a very, very interesting period of our evolutionary history. Because pretty much almost every indigenous culture, ancient and contemporary, has within their folklore or their mythology or their cosmology an observation that somewhere around about this period we are going to have a tremendous change in the way in which we live our lives. I mean, the Maori, for example, which I learned when I was here 3 years ago, I also learned, of course, that the Maori, or certainly elements of the Maori, believe that they are the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians. But they refer to this time, and it translates as the lifting of the veil. And of course, the meaning of the word apocalypse is the revealing, the revelation. And in fact, when I get back to the UK in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks as of tomorrow, we have an event in London called On the Cusp of the Apocalypse. And of course, the mainstream